secure areas in themselves. And then around the blocks, there was another fence that was all the way around. And these fences were, I would guess, 8 feet high, and they had a shelf on them. And all the way around all of these blocks, the entire fox farm had another fence around it to escape any or prevent escape of foxes. And I believe on the inside of that, there was a wooden fence that surrounded all of Farm Brothers Neiman. And it was called the board fence. And when you went in there, you had a lot of gates to open up. It was a very secure operation as far as the escape of foxes.
There really isn't an awful lot left as far as like any of the pens or the fences and that stuff. The federal barns are still there, Roger, right? That's where
Yes.
we had the picture taken on Green Bay Road.
That's right.
And then I think, now Clarence and Art, you guys work for Herb, I think, and I think the barn on Wauwatosa Road just north of Mequon Road was part of
Right.
Herb's operation, and that whole Solar Heights subdivision was really part of the Herb Neiman operation.
That was where the trucks were loaded for shipping up to Hermansville, Michigan.
Okay, Clarence, you got the stage.
Oh, okay.
Your turn.
Well, ready? Okay.
Anytime you're ready.
Okay, I started out at Cedarburg Fox Farm under Henry Drashevsky, and I worked there for 3 summers. And there was probably a dozen good football players at that time. And if you were in the point of sports, you had no trouble getting all the weightlifting that you wanted. And many, many times, the first thing we did when we got out there was clean kennels. Well, that took at least a good month and a half, and because there's a lot of kennels in a block, and those kennels are roughly 5 feet. I would think they're almost 5 feet square, and then they had a shelf in between on top and one on the bottom, and when you open up these roofs, there was a 2x4 in there that you could prop up to hold that heavy roof. And then there was a cover over that was in a barrel. You had to be kind of careful when you opened that cover up. A kind of Ma and Pa Kettle were in there with the kids, and they didn't like the idea of you snooping around, and you had to be pretty careful so they wouldn't nip you in the face. And once you made your entryway into the kennel, or into the barrel, they were under the kennel and they would get you in the legs. So it was a losing battle all the way around, but that's why most of us all wore high 13-inch boots to accommodate that idea. And after cleaning kennels, then we all drew straws, all of us high school kids, and who was going to do what? Because it wasn't fair for one person to sit there and do dishes for a constant summer, and so some of us we'd pulled straws for our jobs, and it was very acceptable to the boss, and some of us would go to Cedarburg with the truck and unload bran from the railroad cars that would come in, because that was one of the main ingredients for the food. And some of us would be chaining. Cedarburg Fox Farm was noted for that, for breaking land for raising crop, hay and oats for the horses. And two young kids would go along out with the old fellas that would be driving the tractors, and they showed us how to hook a chain around something so it wouldn't slip off. And that's what you did all day, from one little tree to the next little tree. And we cleaned off a lot of acreage that way, and we had also raised some wonderful crops and hay galore. Oh, heavenly days. And when it was baling time, two guys would sit on the back end of one of them old case balers, and they would be poking wires in, and the other one would poke the wire in, the other one would be tying that wire, and then the guy that would just spit the bales right out on the ground, and those were full 100-pound bales, and two guys would grab a hay fork, a 3-tined hay fork, and they would pitch them on the wagon like that. And you do that all day long, you don't have to do calisthenics. And
Clarence, I don't want to interrupt you, but when you say the Cedarburg Ranch, okay, and I know Hank Krzyzewski, I think, was superintendent, and I think Ruth is here today, his daughter. Where was that located? Was that what eventually became the Stevenson?
No.
Oh, no, they were separate. Where was the Cedarburg Ranch located, Clarence? I really don't know.
Cedar Creek Road. I and Cedar Creek.
Oh, okay, north. Okay, where Sherwood...
If the Cedar Creek would go through, the creek is right there.
Okay.
Covered Bridge Park is coming in from the opposite side.
Where the Sherwood Forest subdivision is
Right,
now, or that's what...
right.
Okay, just to clarify that.
Yep. And, well, then the next big job was, after that job was over, then they gave us a big job of tattooing. Well, Art told a lot about tattooing already, and each animal had to be caught, all the pups had to be caught because Ma and Pa already had their numbers in their ears. And we tattooed, like Art said, the block number, and the yard number and section number. That was all recorded, so that when you caught a fox on the outside, you knew exactly where that animal belonged. And so then when we were tattooing, before we'd catch all these animals, and then we would you grab them by the tail, possible, and you'd slide your hand up their back to their head and kind of grab so that you take his nose and his mouth together, and so his little sharp teeth won't hurt you anymore. And then with the other hand, you'd grab for all 4 legs, and you held him, and he was helpless, so he had to take that little buzzing in his ear if he liked it or not. And they cut their cords, their toe cords, just like they do for cats, and they were all done digging after that point of the picture. And then before we'd release them, there was a can of powder, and they would powder each animal, believe this or not, with DDT, and which is highly isn't used anymore. And that took care of all the fleas and the lice and everything else that was on them animals. So I believe at that time we got something like, Roger said, 45 cents an hour you got?
We started at 35, but the next year we got moved up to 45.
Well, I think we started with 45 and worked up to 65.
Well, maybe I was in the wrong place.
Art brought a pay stub along that he had from, when was that, Art? When was that pay stub from, Art?
Pardon?
When was your pay stub from?
My check or?
Yeah, your check stub, yeah.
52.5 cents an hour. That was feeder, for being a feeder. That was a top job to be a feeder, you know, that you could. They paid you 52.5 cents an hour, and you got a raise every once in a while with 2.5 cents. That was a quarter a day because you work 10 hours a day. I got my worksheet over there. You work 10 hours a day every day, Saturdays, and 4 hours for Sundays. And then it got to be April when we started feeding with pans, then they gave you 5 hours of pay. Well, you had it in the morning, you picked up the pans before you went to church. Sometimes I took Frida along, she helped me. I picked up the pans, and then you went and unhooked the horse. Then you went to church. And then after 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, then the meat would be there. Then you had to go out and feed them. So it was okay. I mean, you didn't have a lot of spare time. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about them horses, because, you know, where did them horses come from? A lot of people don't know. Well, this was like in the 1924, and they got a lot of mules in at first, and they were put up there, and that's why it was called Mule Hill. There were a lot of mules there. Then they also had, by the church down there, what's the name of that church there on Highland Road, you know, by
Crossroads Presbyterian.
Crossroads, where that parking lot is, they had a big fence there. They had horses in there. And my dad had a horse, he had a couple of horses, but this one was ready for a fox farm. So he hitched the tub buggy up, put the horse in the back, and he rode down the road, and he says, I'm taking him to the fox farm, which was over by Federal Foods, see. And okay, he come back, and we felt sad about the horse, you know. You know how you get attached to him. But the next morning, he heard some noise down by the barn. Here stands the horse. Well, you know, the fencing wasn't too good. You know, a page wire fence, and the horses have been reaching over, you know, and getting the greener grass on the other side, you know. So Dad had to hitch up the buggy once more and take the horse back. And when he went over, they said, well, we'll take care of him right now. So that was the end of that. But getting back to these horses, you know, most of them came from the south and most of them from the west. You see, in the 24s or close, you know, 25, 26, when these big farms got mechanized, they all had 12 or 14 or 16 horses out there on these big farms. So they had to get rid of those horses. So that's where the horses mostly came from, out west. There were some mules in there, but not many, because I seen the horses that came in by Herb Neiman down there. Their slaughterhouse was over there when you go on the Mecklen Road by the old brewery there, and you go in by the school that way, you know, see. They had 3 butchers there, and they could butcher about 20 horses a day, and that was quite a job. But they, as you say, they brought in 3 horses. Each one got a bullet, and then while they skinned them, and that skinning went 1, 2, 3. You know, they skinned the head and the legs and the belly. And then they put a cable on the ears, and they pulled the hide right out up to the tail. And it was 1, 2, 3, that horse was skinned. I don't like to talk about it. But I was working right there where they were. The guys that were butchers, they'd sit on the horse and eat their sandwiches. And I was kind of young there, you know. And I'd eat my sandwich, and once in a while I thought, are there any raisins in this bread? So I had to be a little careful, you know, and I'm telling you, you had to do a little swallowing to eat that sandwich, because in the summertime, those flies were thick. But I wanted to mention that because that's where the horses came from, you know, and they paid about 6 cents a pound. That's what they told me, you know, see, so it was pretty cheap meat, you know, see, and that's why later on they had to go more to different food, you know, they didn't get the horse meat anymore, and those butcher shops the butchers took care of Stevenson's and then Orlando Neiman's, so there were 3 big places, and they slaughtered a lot of horses, and if I took a load of meat out, it was over a ton of meat, you know, about 2,400 pounds, like 250 pounds in a tub, and you had you had about 13 tubs that you fed, you know, see, and when you had a fox pair with 6, 7, or 8 foxes, you had to fill that dish up pretty big, you know, see. And if the dish was pulled out the next morning, which you didn't like, was then you had to run in the yard and pick it up, you know, see. That meant they were a little hungry. You had to give them a little more.
Okay. Howard, any more to?
I think I introduced myself, I think.
Okay. Okay, Gordon.
Well, I have a little different history here because I was a kid when these guys were working so hard. I was born in 41, and of course as a kid I lived on the farm for the first 6 years, and then we moved to the city on Washington Avenue, but I lived near Evergreen and Western Avenue, in a big yellow house there. And of course when I was a kid I remember how much fun it was, especially catching the foxes. As Clarence talked about, it was a real kick to get in that pen and have the fox run past you and try to grab its tail, and then hold it far enough away. Its tail is not muscular enough for it to pull itself up, so you could take it over and bring it to the kennel, and it would want to go in the kennel because it was a safe place. That's really its den, and that's when you could follow up what Clarence said about running your hand up and catching the neck and hoping that the fox didn't catch any part of you. I didn't know about the details of the tattoos and so forth, but the tattoos were critical to this business. I think, Art, you mentioned about tracking the animals. That's to track the genetics, because you wanted to know the price of pelt brought later so you could go back to that family and keep on breeding them, especially if they had the right kit count or pup count or cub count. It's a different word depending upon where you read. A lot of the things that have been mentioned lead to knowing something about the actual biology of the fox. And they've caught these initial silver strain foxes between 1900 and 1920. And there was a family, I think on Prince Edward Island, that actually got the strain to breed true. The silver fox is part of a whole set of subspecies of the red fox. 7 are red, 1's dark, and 1's the silver. And they kept on working on that silver fox to make sure it would breed true, and that meant they had to have good record keeping. The records were kept ultimately on punch cards, and the old IBM kind of punch cards were first done by key sorting the cards with wires so they could track the families and pull out pricing and pull out lineage and all this other kind of information. It was a major part of the whole story. It was keeping those tattoos. That's why you wanted to know where they came from, because if a fox got out of the pen and then got out into the large yards, but you could still catch it, you wanted to put it back exactly where it came from in order to keep those records clean. So the records were critical to the whole industry. That also became true in the mink industry. And mink didn't have big enough ears, and so they would, usually if a mink got out, they'd just harvest, is how they called it, harvest the mink the next winter because it was, the genetic strain was lost. Fur-bearing animals require really careful record keeping. You might have wondered, why is there a double hut? Some of the pictures over there show the 2 huts, part of the fox houses. Foxes in the wild usually have at least 2 dens. One's a decoy den, and one is the den they happen to be living in. So there are pictures that we have of mothers taking their cubs from one side to the other side, moving the whole family over to the other side. There also might have been a reason in the wild to get a fresh den to cut the parasite count. As you mentioned with the DDT, parasites can be a major problem, especially on later on. The lice were a major problem. In fact, my father hired a young PhD in entomology who came to work on our farm. George Quito was his name. And he was brought specifically to develop more effective methods for treating the lice. Later in his career, George Quito became a professor of entomology at the University of Wisconsin, and he recently stopped by to visit my sister Carol, who lives still in town here, just to say hi, he and his wife Ruth. But there was lots of research going on at the fox farm. In fact, in my dad's part of it, in his office, there were all kinds of chemical reagents and special scales to measure the fat content of the food and to track the vitamin content. It became critical with the mink later on. Foxes are omnivores. They'll eat anything, including grass. And so later on, meal and fish was put into the fox food because the horse supply was dwindling. In the case of the mink, it's a strict carnivore, and so you had to be sure that everything you fed it was adequate for its needs, especially vitamins. So a lot of that research was done through students at the University of Wisconsin who would come over and live with us and do the research right on the farm. Another problem was the endocrinology. At the time that you guys were reviewing, the belief was that the foxes had to be moved to the North Country for the development and full priming of their fur. It also might have made them more robust, running free and so forth. But it turns out that most of that's controlled through the pituitary gland, and the shortening days of fall are changing the endocrinology, and now they can raise foxes or mink in the southern part of the country without ever moving them anywhere. And as the light changes, of course you can't go too far south, because you do need the light change to kick in the change in the endocrinology. A tremendous amount has been learned about foxes and about dogs and about cats from initially the fox industry. Distemper serum, for example, was developed from laboratories. Is it off of Green Bay Road or over in that area somewhere?
Lakefield.
Lakefield. They developed it first for foxes because it was a major killer of the foxes. And if the foxes died before they were ready for market, you didn't get very much money for the labor that had gone in that far. Later on, it was also adapted to dogs, which I mentioned are a relative of the foxes, very close relative, and later to cats, which are a similar relative. So you probably guessed, my background is zoology, and my PhD is in zoology, and I probably got that start from living at the fox farm and having men like George Quito help dissect a frog or other things that weren't really related to foxes but were much more interesting. Catching the foxes probably was like you with the horses, that was my high, getting in that pen and chasing them around and being able to ride with the guys on the truck, or in the first days with the horses and the wagons, and later on we replaced them after the war with jeeps and trucks, because the one less thing to care for, basically, except with the truck was a problem. Hermansville was used all the way through, I think, until kind of the demise of the fox industry. There's still some foxes out there, but the main reason that the industry lost tremendous sales was after the war, the government was needing money, and they put an excise tax on all garments, not only fully furred garments, but all garments trimmed with fur, a 20% excise tax. And it just killed the market. And styles had gone from the chubbies, full jackets, to more trim and scarves. And this tax really hurt the whole industry. I think at one time between the Frums and the Niemans, they were producing 100,000 foxes a year. Yeah. This truly was the world center for the production of foxes. But that whole industry went away, and mink moved in and took its place. And most of the same people were involved in the mink industry.
Well, Gordon, I can add something to that. When the fox industry really went out, it was a lot of problems because Norway was bringing in a lot of foxes a lot cheaper. And it turned out that Norway had bought a lot of breeders from Fromm Brothers someplace along the way. And so these foxes were brought into New York to the auction house. And Norway was getting cheaper prices than Fromm's were. So all these fox garments and everything, first of all, the fox pelts were sold at auction. Then Fromm Brothers had a beautiful store or a showroom in New York where they had all kinds of garments made up with fox trim. And these garments were sold at that point. But then all of a sudden, people wouldn't wear fox clothes. Well, now they say that Norway is bringing in foxes, and the fox industry is picking up considerably. And I have one little thing to tell you here. It took, I better get this straight, it took 18 fox pelts to make a coat. Now, that was why fox coats were so expensive, because it took 18 pelts just to make one coat. And it took 45 to 70 mink pelts to make a coat. So that explains the cost of your mink, because these had to all be skinned and taken to the auction and then sold on the auction block. But now it's coming back.
I can tell you that when we were growing up and working on the farm, my dad required that the boys start working at 12. Oh, by the way, I started at 65 cents an hour. Just thought,
Guess I was the wrong place.
but I didn't start till I was born in 41, so I probably didn't start till 53. But the job was just as difficult, but it was great for building the muscles for football, as you mentioned, Clarence. It really was heavy work. And as a 12-year-old, I worked from 7 o'clock in the morning till noon. We had an hour off for lunch. And then we worked from 1 till 6 all summer long, not during the school year. And I learned a tremendous amount from the other people working there. Things like, I learned quite a vocabulary, first of all. And a lot of it was in German, and I didn't know what it meant, but I could say it correctly. So I have been corrected on some of those kinds of usage. I wanted to mention one thing about the digging of the holes that a number of you have talked about. When my father, who had a research background, he was a metallurgical engineer and off to work in blast furnaces and such, but he married this lovely young woman, the only daughter of John Frederick Niemann, and John Frederick worked very hard to get him to join the business, because he really was headed for a research career in metals. When he came to Cedarburg rather, he started to notice certain things. His background was research, and one of the things was digging holes on Sunday afternoon.